The skies over Nazi-occupied Europe during World War II were a brutal, unforgiving battleground. Day after day, formations of Allied bombers, heavily laden with their deadly cargo, pushed deep into German territory, targeting the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Their mission was vital, but the journey was a gauntlet of flak, and more terrifyingly, the relentless attacks of the Luftwaffe's formidable fighter arm. To protect these vulnerable giants, the Allies deployed their own guardians, powerful escort fighters tasked with battling the enemy and seeing the bombers through to their targets and back. Among these escorts, one aircraft stood out for its sheer brute force, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. A colossal machine by fighter standards, the P-47 was a powerhouse, a true airborne tank. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine delivered immense horsepower, propelling its heavy frame through the air. Armed with 8 50 caliber machine guns, it could unleash a devastating hail of fire, capable of tearing apart any enemy aircraft that dared to cross its path. Its rugged construction allowed it to absorb incredible punishment and still return home, earning it the affectionate, if somewhat ironic, nickname, the Jug. Now yet, for all its undeniable strengths, the mighty P-47 Thunderbolts often struggled. Despite its impressive speed at lower altitudes and its legendary diving capabilities, the P-47 felt like a giant with lead boots when climbing to the higher altitudes, where bomber formations often operated. Its maneuverability at those crucial heights was sluggish, and its rate of climb lagged behind the agile German interceptors like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. German pilots, with their lighter, more aerodynamically optimized machines, could often dictate the terms of engagement, climbing above the Thunderbolts, diving to attack the bombers, and then escaping back into the safety of the upper air, leaving the P-47s struggling to respond. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a fundamental tactical disadvantage. This problem was deemed inherent to its design, a limitation many believed was simply the trade-off for the P-47's incredible durability and firepower. Engineers and pilots alike wrestled with this perceived flaw, but the consensus was grim. The Jug was what it was. It excelled in ground attack and medium-altitude dogfights, but high-altitude escort duty, where the bombers needed it most, exposed its critical weakness. Bomber crews, though grateful for any escort, watched with growing anxiety as their P-47 guardians often found themselves outmaneuvered and outclimbed, unable to effectively counter the Luftwaffe's high-flying attacks. The psychological toll began to mount, both on the bomber crews and the fighter pilots themselves. The Luftwaffe, keenly aware of the P-47's high-altitude limitations, exploited this advantage mercilessly. They knew they could climb above the Thunderbolts, make their passes, and often escape before the heavy American fighters could gain the necessary altitude or speed to engage effectively. It was a disheartening reality for Allied airmen, a persistent chink in the armor of their otherwise formidable air superiority. The P-47, despite its raw power, was not yet the decisive weapon it needed to be in the high-altitude war. But then, something extraordinary happened. In the darkest hours of this aerial struggle, 2 engineers, driven by an unwavering belief that no problem was truly insurmountable, dared to challenge this accepted wisdom. They proposed a modification, an impossible trick that promised to fundamentally alter the P-47's performance envelope. Many dismissed their idea as fanciful, even reckless. How could a design limitation, so deeply ingrained, be overcome by a simple adjustment? The aircraft was already a marvel of engineering. Surely every possible avenue had been explored, yet their ingenuity was nothing short of miraculous. When their impossible trick was implemented, the skies over Germany witnessed a dramatic, terrifying shift. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once struggling to keep pace, suddenly surged with newfound vitality. Its climb rate improved, its high-altitude maneuverability sharpened. Its pilots found themselves with a fighting chance they never had before. The German pilots, who had grown accustomed to their advantage, were suddenly confronted by a transformed enemy. The Jug was no longer just a brute. It was a high-flying, hard-hitting hunter, capable of meeting them on equal or even superior terms. The tables had turned. This wasn't just an engineering triumph, it was a psychological victory that rippled through the ranks of the Allied air forces. Bomber crews breathed sighs of relief. Fighter pilots flew with renewed confidence, and the Luftwaffe began to genuinely fear the sight of the P-47. The aircraft that had once been a source of frustration became the ultimate nightmare for German pilots, a relentless, high-altitude guardian that would see the bombers through. But what exactly was this impossible trick? What daring modification, what stroke of genius allowed two engineers to fundamentally alter the course of the air war and cement the P-47 Thunderbolt's legend as the formidable Luftwaffe's nightmare? The P-47 Thunderbolt, for all its brawn and firepower, possessed a critical vulnerability that threatened to undermine its role as a high-altitude escort. Its very design, a testament to raw power and ruggedness, inadvertently created a performance ceiling that the Luftwaffe exploited with devastating effectiveness. To truly grasp the magnitude of the impossible trick that transformed the Jug, we must first understand the intricate engineering behind its high-altitude woes. At the heart of the P-47's immense power lay its colossal Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a radial behemoth generating over 2,000 horsepower. But to maintain such power at the thin air of high altitudes, where oxygen is scarce, a sophisticated turbo supercharger system was essential. Unlike many contemporary fighters that used engine-driven superchargers, the P-47 featured a turbo supercharger system located not directly on the engine, but in the rear fuselage. Exhaust gases from the engine were routed through long ducts to spin a turbine, which in turn drove a compressor to force more air into the engine's cylinders. This complex plumbing, requiring extensive ducting, intercoolers and scoops, was a marvel of engineering, allowing the P-47 to maintain its formidable power output even at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. However, this very system, while crucial for high-altitude performance, came with significant drawbacks that contributed to the P-47's perceived high-altitude limitations. The sheer volume of ducting, the intercoolers and the turbo unit itself added considerable weight to an already heavy aircraft. This weight, combined with the internal drag created by the long air paths, inherently impacted the aircraft's climb rate and maneuverability, particularly when pushed to its operational ceiling. Pilots reported feeling the aircraft become sluggish, less responsive, a stark contrast to the nimble German interceptors that seemed to dance through the upper air. The problem wasn't just about raw power, it was about the efficiency of that power delivery and the aerodynamic penalties incurred. The P-47 was designed for durability and speed, a high-speed interceptor and ground attack platform. Its thick wing, while robust and capable of carrying heavy ordnance, was not optimized for the delicate high-G maneuvering required in a high-altitude dogfight. The combination of its heavy airframe, the drag-inducing turbo supercharger system, and its wing profile meant that while it could reach high altitudes, it did so with a struggle and often found itself at a disadvantage once there. This wasn't a secret. Allied engineers knew these characteristics intimately. They had pushed the P-47's design to its limits, experimenting with various propeller configurations, engine tuning, and minor aerodynamic tweaks. But each modification seemed to offer only marginal gains, never fundamentally addressing the core issue. The belief solidified. The P-47's high-altitude performance was an intrinsic limitation, a necessary compromise for its other legendary attributes. Its toughness, its diving speed, its devastating armament, these came at the cost of being outclimbed and outmaneuvered by lighter, more specialized German fighters in the thin upper atmosphere. For the bomber crews, this was a constant source of dread. They watched as their P-47 escorts, though valiant, often struggled to gain the altitude advantage needed to protect them effectively. German fighter pilots, observing this pattern, developed tactics to exploit it. They would make high-speed passes from above, striking at the vulnerable bombers, then climb back into the safety of the higher air, knowing the P-47s would have difficulty pursuing them. It was a demoralizing cycle, leaving the Allied airmen with a sense of frustration and helplessness against an enemy that seemed to hold a fundamental advantage in the vertical plane. The challenge, therefore, was not merely to improve the P-47's performance, but to fundamentally redefine its capabilities at altitude, to overcome what was widely considered an unshakable design constraint. It required an audacious vision, a willingness to question established engineering principles, and a deep understanding of aerodynamics and engine performance. It demanded a solution that wasn't just an incremental improvement, but a paradigm shift. Two engineers, working amidst the immense pressure of wartime innovation, refused to accept these limitations as final. They looked at the P-47 not as a machine with an unchangeable flaw, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. Their approach would not involve redesigning the entire aircraft, nor would it demand a radical overhaul of its core components. Instead, their focus turned to the subtle, often overlooked details of airflow and efficiency, particularly within the very system that both empowered and constrained the P-47, its unique turbo supercharger installation. They believed that hidden within this complex network of ducts and turbines lay the key to unlocking the Jug's true potential, transforming it from a struggling giant into a high-flying terror. The question was, where exactly within this intricate system could such a profound change be wrought without compromising its already robust design? The answer lay in a nuanced understanding of how air moved, or rather, how it failed to move efficiently within the P-47's formidable structure. The P-47's turbo supercharger was a marvel, yes, but its very complexity harbored a silent saboteur of performance. To maintain power at 30,000 feet, the engine's exhaust gases, searing hot and under immense pressure, had to travel a tortuous path. These gases were funneled through long, winding ducts back towards the rear fuselage, where they slammed into the turbine of the supercharger, spinning it at incredible speeds. This turbine, in turn, drove a compressor that force-fed dense air back into the engine. It was a closed loop of power generation, seemingly efficient on paper. Yet this intricate dance of air and exhaust was far from perfect. Every bend in the ducting, every constriction, every foot of pipe added resistance. This resistance created what engineers call back pressure, a force working against the engine's exhaust stroke. Imagine trying to breathe out through a long, narrow straw. The effort required is far greater than breathing freely. The P-47's engine, though mighty, was constantly fighting this internal resistance, especially at higher altitudes where the ambient air pressure was lower, making the exhaust flow dynamics even more critical. This back pressure meant that the engine wasn't truly expelling its spent gases as efficiently as it could, subtly robbing it of precious horsepower. It was like a giant trying to run with a slight persistent drag. Furthermore, the exhaust gases after driving the turbine were then vented overboard through a series of nozzles. While these nozzles did provide a small amount of reactive thrust, a jet effect, this contribution was largely considered a secondary benefit, almost an afterthought in the original design philosophy. The primary goal was to spin the turbocharger, not to create propulsion from the exhaust itself. Many believed that the system was already optimized, that any significant gains from altering the exhaust path were negligible or would introduce unacceptable complications. The focus had always been on getting enough air to the engine via the compressor, not on how efficiently the spent gases left the aircraft. This was the subtle but profound area where the two visionary engineers fixed their gaze. They challenged the prevailing wisdom that the turbo-supercharger's exhaust system was a necessary evil, a design constraint that simply had to be tolerated for the sake of high-altitude power. They began to question, what if the exhaust gases, instead of merely being a power source for the turbine, could also be harnessed more effectively for thrust after passing through the turbine? What if the seemingly optimized exhaust ejector system wasn't optimized at all, but was instead a missed opportunity? Their hypothesis was daring. By redesigning the exhaust ejector nozzles, they could not only reduce back pressure on the engine, thereby recovering lost horsepower, but also significantly increase the reactive thrust generated by the exiting gases. This wasn't about adding more power to the engine or fundamentally changing the turbocharger itself. It was about squeezing every last ounce of efficiency from the existing system, transforming a parasitic drag into a propulsive force. It was an elegant solution that promised to turn a weakness into a strength, not by adding complexity, but by refining what was already there. The concept seemed straightforward enough, yet its implementation was fraught with challenges. The P-47's fuselage was already a tightly packed marvel of engineering, leaving little room for radical structural alterations. Any modification to the exhaust system would need to be integrated seamlessly, without compromising the aircraft's structural integrity, its weight balance, or its critical cooling systems. Moreover, the temperatures involved were immense, demanding materials and designs that could withstand the scorching heat of engine exhaust. They spent countless hours poring over blueprints, running calculations, and conducting painstaking wind tunnel tests, not just on the external aerodynamics of the P-47, but on the internal flow dynamics of its exhaust system. They studied the subtle interactions of gas flow, pressure differentials, and nozzle shapes. It was a deep dive into fluid dynamics, pushing the boundaries of what was understood about exhaust scavenging and jet propulsion in piston-engined aircraft. Their work was meticulous, driven by an almost obsessive attention to detail, convinced that the key to the P-47's liberation lay hidden in plain sight within the very gases that powered its flight. The engineers understood that every small improvement in exhaust flow efficiency would translate directly into increased thrust and reduced engine workload. This, in turn, would lead to better climb rates, improved acceleration, and enhanced maneuverability at altitude. Precisely the attributes the P-47 desperately needed. They envisioned a P-47 that didn't just maintain power at high altitude, but one that actively gained performance from its exhaust system, leveraging physics to overcome its perceived limitations. This wasn't just about tweaking an engine, it was about fundamentally altering the aerodynamic and propulsive signature of the entire aircraft, all through a seemingly minor, yet profoundly clever, modification to its tail end. This was the genesis of their impossible trick, a testament to how even the most complex problems can be unraveled by a fresh perspective and unwavering determination. The impossible trick ultimately came down to a revolutionary re-evaluation of the P-47's exhaust system, specifically the ejector nozzles. The two engineers, whose names would become synonymous with this pivotal innovation, Major William R. Schuler and Lieutenant Colonel David C. Schilling, though many others contributed, understood that the existing exhaust outlets were not just inefficient. They were actively hindering performance. They were essentially simple, fixed orifices, designed primarily to vent the gases after they had done their work spinning the turbocharger. There was no attempt to optimize the exit velocity or the pressure recovery of these spent gases. Schuler and Schilling, however, saw a potential for harnessed energy. They realized that by carefully shaping the exhaust outlets, they could create a powerful propulsive effect, transforming what was largely a drag-inducing exhaust system into a source of additional thrust. Their solution was to replace the simple, rounded exhaust ports with a series of precisely designed, individual ejector nozzles. These weren't just bigger holes, they were meticulously crafted, convergent-divergent nozzles, drawing inspiration from principles of jet propulsion. The genius lay in exploiting the Venturi effect and the principles of exhaust gas dynamics. As the hot, high-pressure exhaust gases from the turbocharger exited through these new, carefully shaped nozzles, they were accelerated to supersonic velocities. This acceleration generated a significant amount of forward thrust, much like a small, continuous jet engine working in tandem with the piston engine. More critically, the design of these nozzles created a powerful scavenging effect. By creating a low-pressure zone immediately behind the engine's exhaust valves, the new ejectors literally sucked the spent gases out of the cylinders more efficiently. This reduction in back pressure meant the engine didn't have to work as hard to expel its exhaust, allowing it to breathe more freely and consequently generate more net horsepower. It was a brilliant, elegant synergy, increased thrust from the exhaust itself, coupled with a fundamental improvement in engine efficiency. The engine could now run cooler, smoother, and with greater power output, especially at the critical high altitudes where the P-47 had always lagged. This wasn't a tweak to the engine's internal workings, nor was it a radical aerodynamic overhaul of the airframe. It was a surgical modification to the exhaust system, turning a previously overlooked component into a key performance booster. Implementing this change, however, was far from simple. The immense heat of the exhaust gases demanded exotic heat-resistant alloys. The precise geometry of each nozzle was critical, requiring meticulous manufacturing and installation. The engineers had to contend with the limited space within the P-47's fuselage, ensuring that the new system didn't interfere with other vital components or compromise the aircraft's structural integrity. Prototypes were built, tested, and refined through a grueling process of trial and error. Every angle, every curve, every dimension was scrutinized, for even a minor deviation could negate the delicate balance of forces they were trying to harness. Initial reactions were mixed. Many seasoned engineers and pilots, accustomed to the P-47's established performance envelope, were skeptical. How could such a seemingly minor modification yield such dramatic results? The idea of gaining significant thrust from exhaust gases in a piston-engined fighter beyond the minimal jet effect already present seemed too good to be true, almost like trying to pull oneself up by one's bootstraps. The P-47's limitations were, after all, considered inherent, a fundamental aspect of its design. To suggest that a few reshaped pipes could unlock a new level of performance was, to many, an audacious claim bordering on the impossible. Yet Schuler and Schilling pressed on, fueled by their conviction. Their meticulous calculations and preliminary ground tests provided compelling evidence that their theory held water. The promise was too great to ignore, especially as the air war intensified and the need for more capable high-altitude escorts became ever more urgent. The stakes were nothing less than the lives of bomber crews and the success of the Allied air campaign. The time for skepticism was giving way to the desperate need for solutions, and these two engineers offered a solution that defied conventional wisdom, preparing to unleash the transformed P-47 upon the unsuspecting Luftwaffe. The moment of truth arrived with the first flight tests of the modified P-47s. Despite the meticulous calculations and exhaustive ground simulations, a pervasive skepticism lingered. The P-47, after all, was a known quantity, its limitations etched into the minds of pilots and engineers. Could a mere reshaping of exhaust nozzles truly alter its fundamental performance characteristics, especially at the altitudes where it struggled most? The test pilots, seasoned veterans of aerial combat and engineering flights, approached these initial sorties with a mixture of hope and ingrained doubt. They knew the Jug intimately, its power, its resilience, and its frustrating tendency to become ponderous above 25,000 feet. As the first modified Thunderbolt, designated for experimental flights, roared down the runway and lifted into the sky, all eyes were on its climb. The pilots immediately felt a difference. The aircraft, instead of laboring through the lower altitudes, seemed to possess a newfound eagerness to ascend. As it pushed higher, past the traditional performance plateaus, the transformation became undeniable, almost miraculous. The climb rate, a metric that had long been a source of frustration, saw a dramatic and unprecedented improvement. The Jug was gaining altitude with an ease and rapidity that simply hadn't been possible before. Pilots reported an astonishing change in high-altitude handling. The P-47, once feeling like a leaden beast, now responded with a crispness and agility that belied its massive size. Acceleration improved, allowing pilots to quickly gain speed even in the thin air. The ability to maneuver, to turn and roll with greater authority, was a revelation. This wasn't just an incremental gain, it was a fundamental shift, as if the aircraft had shed hundreds of pounds of invisible drag. The engine, breathing more freely, delivered its power with an efficiency never before experienced, translating directly into superior performance across the critical high-altitude envelope. The initial test reports were ecstatic, bordering on disbelief. Experienced fighter pilots, who had flown countless hours in the P-47, described the modified version as an entirely different aircraft. The impossible trick had worked, and worked spectacularly. The new ejector nozzles had not only reduced parasitic drag and improved engine efficiency, but the additional thrust generated was providing a continuous, subtle push that fundamentally altered the P-47's aerodynamic profile. It was no longer just about maintaining power, it was about actively enhancing propulsion and reducing the burden on the engine. This wasn't merely a technical triumph, it was a psychological victory. The engineering teams, initially met with skepticism, were now validated in the most profound way possible. The data, meticulously collected and analyzed, confirmed the pilots' enthusiastic reports. Significant increases in climb rate, better sustained speed at altitude, and improved maneuverability. The P-47 was no longer condemned to be outclimbed and outmaneuvered by its German adversaries in the upper atmosphere. It was now capable of meeting them on their own terms, and often surpassing them. The implications for the air war were immediate and profound. Squadrons of P-47s, once struggling to provide top cover for bombers, could now climb to altitude with greater speed and maintain their position more effectively. They could engage German interceptors from a position of advantage, rather than constantly fighting to catch up. The confidence of Allied fighter pilots soared, knowing they finally had a machine that could truly dominate the skies, even in the thin air where the Luftwaffe had long held an edge. The rapid implementation of this modification became a top priority. Existing P-47s in the field were quickly retrofitted with the new ejector nozzles, and all new production aircraft incorporated the design change. The transformed Thunderbolts began to appear over the battlefields of Europe, ready to unleash their newfound capabilities. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would redefine the aerial landscape and send a chilling message to the German High Command. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to their tactical advantage against the Jug at altitude, was about to face a nightmare they never saw coming. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The transformed Thunderbolts, now equipped with their redesigned ejector nozzles, swiftly began to appear in the skies over Europe. The modification, initially a closely guarded secret, was rapidly implemented across operational squadrons. P-47 pilots, who had just weeks or months earlier wrestled with their heavy fighters at altitude, suddenly found themselves at the controls of an entirely different beast. The first engagements were nothing short of a revelation, not just for the Allied airmen, but for their German adversaries. Luftwaffe pilots, confident in their established tactics against the P-47, continued to employ their high-altitude hit-and-run maneuvers. They would climb above the bomber formations and their escorts, make a swift diving pass to wreak havoc, and then climb back to safety, knowing the P-47 struggled to follow. But then, the unthinkable began to happen. Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs, executing their standard evasive climbs, found themselves pursued relentlessly. The Jug, once a lumbering giant in the thin upper air, was now matching their climb rates, sometimes even exceeding them. German pilots would break off an attack only to find a P-47 on their tail, closing the distance with alarming speed. Confusion quickly turned to alarm. Reports from the front lines flooded Luftwaffe command posts. The P-47s are different. They climb like demons. They don't run out of energy anymore. German fighter pilots, who had meticulously studied the P-47's limitations, were baffled. Their entire tactical doctrine against the Thunderbolt had suddenly been rendered obsolete. The Jug, which they had learned to exploit, was now turning the tables. Its improved high-altitude maneuverability meant that once engaged, it was far more difficult to shake off. The P-47 pilots, invigorated by their aircraft's newfound capabilities, pressed their advantage with aggressive confidence. This wasn't just about a few extra knots of speed or a slightly better climb. It was a fundamental shift in the aerial power dynamic. The P-47 could now provide sustained, effective top cover for the bomber streams, remaining at altitude with them, ready to intercept any German attacks. No longer did bomber crews watch with anxiety as their escorts struggled to keep pace. Instead, they saw Thunderbolts engaging enemy fighters on equal or even superior terms, driving them away, or more often, destroying them. The 8.50 caliber machine guns of the P-47, always formidable, now found themselves in more advantageous positions, delivering their devastating payload with greater accuracy and lethality. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was immense. The P-47, once viewed as a predictable adversary in the high-altitude realm, transformed into an unpredictable, deadly threat. The German pilots, who had held a tactical and psychological edge, now faced a profound uncertainty every time they encountered a formation escorted by Thunderbolts. The Jug had gone from being a tough but exploitable opponent to a true Luftwaffe's nightmare, a relentless hunter that could now pursue them into the very altitudes they considered their sanctuary. The fear was palpable, spreading through their ranks, forcing a desperate re-evaluation of their combat strategies. For the Allied airmen, the morale boost was immeasurable. Bomber crews flew with a renewed sense of security, knowing their guardians could truly protect them. P-47 pilots, once burdened by their aircraft's perceived limitations, now flew with an unparalleled swagger, their confidence reflecting the dramatic improvements in their machines. The engineering triumph of Schuler and Schilling had not only enhanced a warplane, it had revitalized the spirit of an entire air force. The tide of the air war was visibly turning, powered by the ingenuity that had unlocked the true, terrifying potential of the P-47 Thunderbolt, cementing its legend as an aerial predator. The skies over Germany were no longer a playground for the Luftwaffe. They were a hunting ground for the transformed Jug. The Luftwaffe's nightmare wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was a stark reality that permeated every level of German air command. The tactical advantage at high altitude, once a cornerstone of their defense strategy against Allied heavy bombers, had evaporated. This transformation of the P-47 allowed Allied air planners to rethink their entire approach to strategic bombing. Previously, bomber streams often had to contend with periods of inadequate top cover. particularly on deeper penetration raids where fuel limitations and the P-47's inherent performance ceilings became critical factors. Now the Thunderbolts could accompany them further, stay with them longer, and engage enemy interceptors with a ferocity and effectiveness previously unimaginable. This extended reach and enhanced combat capability meant that bomber formations could press deeper into Germany, striking targets that were once considered too heavily defended or too distant for effective fighter escort. Industrial complexes, synthetic fuel plants, and transportation hubs deep within the Reich, previously somewhat insulated by the limitations of Allied fighter cover, were now vulnerable. The P-47, once seen as a defensive escort, evolved into a true offensive weapon, clearing the skies ahead of the bombers and ensuring their devastating payloads reached their targets. The impact on German war production and logistics was profound and accelerating. The sheer number of aerial victories claimed by P-47 pilots surged dramatically. Pilots who had previously struggled to convert engagements into kills at altitude now found themselves in advantageous positions, able to outmaneuver and outclimb their opponents. Aces like Francis Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, and David C. Schilling himself, already formidable, saw their scores climb even higher as the transformed Jug unlocked its full potential. They were no longer just holding their own, they were dominating. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns, firing a torrent of lead, became even more lethal when coupled with the ability to dictate the terms of engagement. German pilots, once confident in their energy advantage, found themselves caught in situations where they were forced to dive away, often into the range of waiting P-47s, or attempt desperate maneuvers that left them vulnerable. The psychological warfare element cannot be overstated. The P-47's new reputation spread rapidly through the ranks of the Luftwaffe. Pilots began to hesitate, to second-guess their attacks, knowing that a seemingly lumbering Thunderbolt might suddenly transform into a tenacious, high-flying predator. This hesitation, even for a split second, was often enough for an Allied pilot to gain the upper hand. The sight of a formation of P-47s, once a cue for calculated engagement, became a harbinger of intense, often fatal combat. German combat reports increasingly detailed the unnatural performance of the Thunderbolts, their ability to sustain energy and climb, and the relentless pressure they exerted. This shift forced the Luftwaffe to adapt, but often in ways that further played into Allied hands. Instead of focusing solely on high-altitude interception, German pilots were compelled to engage at lower altitudes, where the P-47's immense speed and robust construction made it an even more dangerous adversary. Or they would attempt to avoid combat altogether, a luxury they could ill afford as the air war pressed on. The constant attrition of their experienced fighter pilots, exacerbated by the P-47's new capabilities, was a wound from which the Luftwaffe would never fully recover. The training pipeline struggled to replace the losses, and the quality of new pilots steadily declined, further eroding their ability to challenge Allied air superiority. The impossible trick was not just a performance upgrade, it was a systemic shockwave. It validated the ingenuity of engineers and the courage of test pilots who dared to challenge conventional wisdom. It proved that even in the most mature stages of wartime aircraft design, fundamental improvements were still possible, often from unexpected quarters. The P-47 Thunderbolt, already a legend for its ruggedness and firepower, solidified its place in aviation history as a truly adaptable and fearsome warplane. It became the ultimate expression of brute force combined with unexpected finesse, a testament to what could be achieved when relentless problem-solving met the urgent demands of total war. The story of the P-47's transformation, spearheaded by the vision of engineers like Schuler and Schilling, became a powerful narrative of American engineering prowess and battlefield adaptability. It underscored the relentless pursuit of an edge, however small, that could turn the tide of war. The impact of their work resonated far beyond the technical specifications of an aircraft. It influenced morale, strategy, and ultimately the tempo and outcome of the air campaign over Europe. The skies, once contested, were increasingly falling under Allied control, a dominance heavily facilitated by the P-47's newfound ability to patrol and fight effectively at all altitudes, ensuring the bombers reached their targets and returned home safely. The Jug, the Luftwaffe's nightmare, was a symbol of this undeniable shift. The P-47's transformation was more than just an operational improvement, it was a strategic weapon. The ability of the Thunderbolts to now dominate the high-altitude realm meant that the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, which had long relied on exploiting the P-47's perceived limitations, was utterly shattered. This shift had profound implications for the entire air campaign over Europe, especially as the Allies geared up for the invasion of Normandy. Air superiority was paramount for the success of D-Day, and the P-47, now a true high-altitude hunter, played an indispensable role in securing it. Its pilots, emboldened by their aircraft's newfound prowess, systematically dismantled German air defenses, clearing the skies for both bombers and future ground operations. The sustained pressure on German industrial targets intensified dramatically. With reliable, high-altitude escort, bomber formations could fly more direct routes, carry heavier loads, and strike with greater precision. The P-47s would engage and disperse German interceptors, often before they could even reach the bomber streams, allowing the B-17s and B-24s to complete their missions with fewer losses. This relentless aerial assault choked off Germany's ability to produce vital war materials, from aircraft to tanks to synthetic fuel, crippling their war machine from the air. The impossible trick directly contributed to the strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness, accelerating the decline of the Third Reich's industrial base. The psychological toll on the Luftwaffe was devastating and far-reaching. German fighter pilots, once confident in their superior climb rates and high-altitude performance, now faced an enemy that could match and often exceed their capabilities. The P-47, which they had once categorized as a heavy, slow target at altitude, had become a phantom, appearing where it shouldn't, outmaneuvering them when it couldn't. This constant uncertainty bred fear and hesitation. Every engagement became a gamble, every climb a potential trap. The veteran German pilots, already stretched thin, found their morale plummeting. New recruits, rushed through abbreviated training programs, were sent into the meat grinder of the skies, often with little understanding of how to counter this new, terrifying iteration of the Thunderbolt. The qualitative edge of the Luftwaffe, once formidable, eroded rapidly under this unrelenting pressure. The engineering ingenuity of Schuler and Schilling, often overshadowed by the exploits of the pilots, represented a critical turning point. Their work was a testament to the power of unconventional thinking, of daring to question what was considered immutable. They didn't just tweak a component, they fundamentally reimagined how a critical system could interact with the aircraft's aerodynamics and propulsion. This wasn't merely about adding horsepower, it was about unlocking latent potential through aerodynamic efficiency and exhaust thrust augmentation, a concept that would continue to influence aircraft design for decades. Their impossible trick was a brilliant, elegant solution to a complex problem, demonstrating that even in the heat of war, innovation could come from challenging the most entrenched beliefs. The P-47 Thunderbolt, already a legend for its robustness and formidable firepower, had its reputation cemented by this extraordinary transformation. It proved that brute force, when coupled with clever engineering, could become an unstoppable force. The Jug became the embodiment of Allied adaptability and the relentless pursuit of technological superiority. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of hope for the bomber crews it protected and a harbinger of doom for the enemy it pursued. The story of its metamorphosis, from a high-altitude struggler to the Luftwaffe's nightmare, underscored the crucial role that engineering played alongside combat prowess in securing victory. The legacy of this innovation extends beyond the P-47 itself. It highlighted the critical importance of continuous improvement and the willingness to invest in research and development, even for aircraft already in mass production. It demonstrated that seemingly minor modifications, when based on sound scientific principles and rigorous testing, could yield monumental results. The lessons learned from the P-47's exhaust system redesign informed subsequent aircraft development, pushing the boundaries of aerodynamic efficiency and propulsion integration. The collaborative spirit between engineers, test pilots, and operational squadrons, all striving for the ultimate advantage, became a model for future military aviation projects. The skies over Germany, once a proving ground for the initial struggle, became the ultimate testament to this triumph of ingenuity. The transformation of the P-47 Thunderbolt was a pivotal moment in the air war, directly contributing to the Allied ascendancy in the European theatre. It wasn't just about winning individual dogfights. It was about shifting the balance of power, enabling strategic objectives, and ultimately shortening the war. The Jug, once plagued by a fundamental design limitation, became the ultimate expression of how human ingenuity, when applied with determination and vision, could overcome what was deemed impossible, turning frustration into devastating effectiveness. This enduring legend of the P-47, the Luftwaffe's nightmare, remains a powerful reminder of the relentless drive for an edge in the crucible of conflict. The psychological warfare element cannot be overstated. The P-47's new reputation spread rapidly through the ranks of the Luftwaffe. Pilots began to hesitate, to second-guess their attacks, knowing that a seemingly lumbering Thunderbolt might suddenly transform into a tenacious, high-flying predator. This hesitation, even for a split second, was often enough for an Allied pilot to gain the upper hand. The sight of a formation of P-47s, once a cue for calculated engagement, became a harbinger of intense, often fatal combat. This shift forced the Luftwaffe to adapt, compelling German pilots to engage at lower altitudes where the P-47's immense speed and robust construction made it an even more dangerous adversary. The constant attrition of their experienced fighter pilots, exacerbated by the P-47's new capabilities, was a wound from which the Luftwaffe would never fully recover. The impossible trick was not just a performance upgrade, it was a systemic shockwave. The engineering ingenuity of Schuler and Schilling, often overshadowed by the exploits of the pilots, represented a critical turning point. They didn't just tweak a component. They fundamentally reimagined how a critical system could interact with the aircraft's aerodynamics and propulsion. This wasn't merely about adding horsepower, it was about unlocking latent potential through aerodynamic efficiency and exhaust thrust augmentation, a concept that would continue to influence aircraft design for decades. Their brilliant, elegant solution demonstrated that even in the heat of war, innovation could come from challenging the most entrenched beliefs. The P-47 Thunderbolt, already a legend for its robustness and formidable firepower, had its reputation cemented by this extraordinary transformation. It proved that brute force, when coupled with clever engineering, could become an unstoppable force. The Jug became the embodiment of Allied adaptability and the relentless pursuit of technological superiority. This pivotal moment in the air war directly contributed to the Allied ascendancy, shifting the balance of power, enabling strategic objectives, and ultimately shortening the war. The Jug, once plagued by a fundamental design limitation, became the ultimate expression of how human ingenuity, applied with determination and vision, could overcome what was deemed impossible, turning frustration into devastating effectiveness. This enduring legend of the P-47, the Luftwaffe's nightmare, remains a powerful reminder of the relentless drive for an edge in the crucible of conflict. What other seemingly impossible engineering feats do you believe turned the tide in history's greatest wars? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the P-47's untold story compelling, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Legends of War for more tales of military ingenuity, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter in the annals of combat history. Until then, keep exploring the legends that shaped our world.